Last week, the University of Balochistan was awash with young people, pushing, shoving, trying to get to the front for a peep of someone you might think was a movie star or some sort of celebrity. But she wasn't. The young lady's name is Dr. Mahrang Baloch, and Mahrang Baloch is a political activist of the kind the province in Pakistan just hasn't seen in generations. Mahrang isn't a separatist or a violent activist or somebody fighting who's fought one of the 6 rounds of insurgency the province has seen. She's just a peaceful political activist who's been demanding accountability for the many hundreds and thousands of Baloch who've disappeared in the course of Pakistan's dirty war to finish stamp out insurgency in the province. Who is Mahrang Baloch? Mahrang was born in 1993 into a middle-class Baloch family. Her father, Abdul Ghaffar Langrove, lived in Quetta for many years before relocating to Karachi. Then in December 2009, her father was forcibly abducted by Pakistani security forces when he was on his way to the hospital in Karachi. At the age of just 16, Mahrang started protesting against his abduction and joined the People's Resistance Movement. Her brother, who was also a protester, was arrested in 2017 and detained for 3 months. And since then, she's flowered into one of the prominent people in the Baloch political movement against enforced disappearances. Dr. Mahrang has also been prominent in the movement against the extraction of natural resources from Balochistan. Balochistan is one of Pakistan's most hydrocarbon-rich areas. It provides vast amounts of gas to the rest of the country. And Baloch activists say that the province itself hasn't benefited from these activities, that it doesn't get its fair share of revenue from gas extraction and from other kinds of mining in the province. And this has been a long-standing Baloch grievance. In 2020, these long-standing grievances were taken up by a group of students protesting against the proposed removal of the quota system at Bolan Medical College, which would have taken away reserved spots for local residents in favor of migrants who've come into the province from Punjab and other parts of the state. This, of course, added, if you like, oil to the fire of local resentment. The students in Balochistan started something called the Long March. The Long March was led by Mahrang and other women activists and headed towards Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, to protect human rights violations, but also the absence of rights for the state. It wanted proper reservations and job opportunities for ethnic Baloch who had been suffering because of the large-scale migration of people into the province looking for jobs and so on. And it, above all, wanted an end to atrocities by the Pakistan army in the name of fighting the insurgency there. To fully understand this complicated story of why Balochistan and the Baloch feel the way they do, you have to go all the way back to at least 1919. The area then was crisscrossed by camel caravans carrying goods from British India all the way to Iran. But in 1919, the British built a railway line from Quetta to Nuski and a whole system of roads cutting across what were once just these camel tracks. In fact, interestingly, Indians had a big role to play in this enterprise, both in building the railway system and Punjabis, rather specifically Sikhs, driving the trucks that then picked up the goods that came into Iran just across the border and carrying them to Tehran and onwards. The British hoped that the system of roads would prevent the Soviet Union from pushing southwards to Zahedan and on to Chabahar. Now, Chabahar, we've still heard of it. It's still a strategically important place. But Chabahar is Iran's only truly oceanic port. And at that point, the fear among the British was that the Russians would occupy Persia and use Chabahar to give access to trade to their own Central Asian Soviet provinces. So anyway, after the train line was built inside months, a Gurdwara and a Punjabi language school sprung up in Zahedan, serving all these truck drivers who'd come in. A journey that took 6 weeks by camel took just 4 days by truck. But this boom in the truck and train system obviously meant that the Baloch no longer had the importance that they had. Their camel convoys just weren't making the kinds of revenues anymore that the Baloch traders and Baloch leaders had relied on. The tribes were in real trouble. In 1931, though, the British shut down the Quetta-Zahedan railway line in response to new laws by King Reza Shah, the Persian ruler, who noticed that there wasn't a balance of trade coming as a result of the railway. His new laws mandated that as many goods be exported from Iran to British India as imported from British India to Iran. Now, obviously, there weren't any big industries in Iran at that point. There was no industrial infrastructure. So this was a death blow to the trade. Basically, the railway line went out of business. And you'd have thought the Baloch would be back. But they weren't quite. And I'll just explain why. Once the railway line collapsed, the tribes did indeed benefit because things like the famous grain trade, which brought food from British India to Iran, fell into the hands of powerful tribes like the Regi, which also began trafficking commodities like sugar and grain into Iran, bypassing the official channels. Silk and silver flowed back into British India. The two governments both tried to stamp out this trafficking, which hurt their tax revenues, obviously. But that effort led to frequent tribal rebellion. Living with their herds in the area of Langdash in what was then Indian Balochistan, as well as Koh-e-Taftan and Mirjaveh, the Regi had served as mercenary soldiers for the British in the First World War and before, in return for protecting the railway and battling bandits. Even as the British ended their occupation of Iranian Balochistan and the Persian king got back his territory, the tribal raiding and rebellions continued. The powerful Baloch chieftains like the legendary Idu Khan set about trying to build a relationship with the king, just as they had a relationship with the British. They were viewed with suspicion both by Tehran and by the tribal chieftains. You see, the Iranian state at that point was engaged in a process of trying to modernize, become Western and European, which included insisting that conscripts clip their beards and wear Western-style uniforms. The king wanted local residents to wear Western dress, he wanted them to disarm, and he wanted them to be educated at new national schools where their children would learn Persian history and languages. The Baloch didn't like this at all. And when they rebelled against it, many were expelled from their homelands and large-scale violence often broke out. In some cases, the Baloch even left Iran for greener pastures. Thousands of families left for the Soviet Union, believe it or not, in the 1920s, because they were promised free irrigation and land in Turkmenistan. They still lived there. Many others asserted claims of citizenship in the British Empire based on their past service in the British Army. But those claims were eventually denied. And then came this thing called independence. Across the border, the Baloch tribes demanded autonomy as the British prepared to withdraw. The 3 or 4 princely states acceded to the new country. The 4th, the Khan of Kalat, had to be bombed into submission. And his sons kept fighting until 1950. Fresh rounds of fighting broke out in the 1960s and again in 1973-1977. Iran, which had supported Islamabad in its war with India in 1971, began to worry that the collapse of Pakistan would open the door for its own Baloch people to rebel. Following Pakistan's defeat in 1971, Tehran-Islamabad relations were deteriorated is not the right word, but certainly lost some confidence and slowly degenerated, Iran began to believe it needed to come down on its Baloch rebels with its own heavier hand. The British railway line across the border, interestingly, briefly reopened after independence, only to shut down again in the 1990s. Despite occasional talk of reopening it for trade, the line is still dead. Amidst this troubled landscape of insurgency, counterinsurgency, President Pervez Musharraf, military ruler of Pakistan who took power after Kargil, pitched in to complicate matters even more. In 2005, there was a tragic case where a Baloch woman was accused to have been raped by a military officer. Even before there was an investigation, General Musharraf declared that the officer was, and I quote, 100% innocent. He even made some tasteless and really, awful remarks that women were getting themselves raped deliberately in return for a green card. These kinds of comments catalyzed Baloch rage over the growing tide of ethnic Punjabi business people and contractors who had begun to settle in the province. There was also frustration over the lack of opportunity for a new generation of educated Baloch, the first who had come up in the province. Led by Nawab Akbar Khan Bukti, the 6th Baloch insurgency began, the first phase of this ending in a brutal showdown with the Pakistani regime, which claimed Nawab Akbar Bukti's life. Many people in Balochistan will tell you to this day that had Musharraf sought a political settlement with Nawab Bukti instead, the course of Baloch history would have been different. But he didn't. He killed him, and that left things where they were. The effects of Musharraf's policies were soon felt. In December 2005, a bomb exploded. The effects of Musharraf's policy, of course, were felt within Balochistan, where there was a growing insurgency, fed by a steady flow of weapons and personnel trained in Afghanistan across the border. But the effects of Musharraf's behavior were felt across the border in Iran too. In December 2005, a bomb exploded right next to a car carrying the then president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Then, in February 2007, a bus transporting soldiers from Iran's Revolutionary Guard was targeted in an ambush, killing 11. Many of these attacks in Iran were led by Abdul Malik Reghi. The group responsible for these attacks, Jandullah, was the product of decades of discrimination against the Baloch people in Iran. Reghi's foot soldiers adopted Sunni jihadist rallying cries over long-established Baloch nationalist slogans, one historian, Alex Matanka, writes, and often clung to Al-Qaeda-type black flags over the leftist slogans of previous insurgencies. Inside Pakistan, meanwhile, the insurgency began to be taken out of the hands of the tribal chieftains by the new generation of educated youth I told you about. Many of these educated Baloch nationalist insurgents emerged from the left-wing study circles centered on a one-time insurgent, Khair Bakhsh Murray. He was to prove an inspirational figure for many, many university students, persuading them of both the need and the winnability of a long insurgency against Pakistan. We now had a very delicate situation. On the western side of the border, you had a Baloch jihadist insurgency with the support of Pakistan's intelligence services. And on the eastern side of the border, a nationalist insurgency which had the support of elements in Iranian intelligence. Encouraged by General Musharraf, an Islamist coalition eventually had risen to power in Pakistan in 2002. This coalition, the Muttahida Majlis-e-Aman, represented politicians who had never held any kind of influence in Pakistani Balochistan. Iranian Islamist groups from Balochistan were also given shelter and training by jihadists in Balochistan who were there with bases for the jihad in Afghanistan. The move further alienated the young nationalists, convincing them that there was no legitimate political space for them in Pakistan, that the Pakistan establishment would shoot down any efforts by them to try and come to power through legitimate political means. This whole thing would backfire spectacularly when Baloch jihadists began striking inside the region itself. One of the key factors to intensify the insurgency on the Iranian side was the consolidation of the so-called Islamic State. According to the scholar Antonio Guistosi, the Islamic State reached out to Iranian Baloch groups around 2014 through its key Afghan commander Abdul Rauf Khatib. In a series of meetings organized in Pakistan, Guistosi writes, the Harkat-e-Ansar-e Iran and Jaish al-Adl, this is a very important group, the Jaish al-Adl, agreed to merge into the Islamic State or at least use it as a brand name for their operations. Islamic State negotiators also reached out to narcotic traffickers like Hassan Khan, hoping to develop their ability to transport more arms into Iran. But according to Guistosi, no deal could be made since the Islamic State wanted Hassan Khan to end his narcotics business and make profits purely from running arms, while he felt the wealth generated by drugs was simply too large to give up. Last month, as you know, things reached something of a flashpoint. Iran conducted airstrikes on what it claims to be bases of the Jaish-e-Adl, that is, the Islamic State, after it carried out similar attacks in Iraq and Syria. Pakistan claims the Iranian missile strikes only ended up killing children, and Iran said exactly the same thing, except we know from various media accounts that at least 94 civilians were killed in the Pakistani attacks. Well, since then, Iran and Pakistan have both backed down because neither country is looking for a war. Iran probably just wanted to make the point that it would be forced to retaliate if Pakistan kept allowing terrorists to attack across the border. Pakistan, which is after all a nuclear weapons state, also had to retaliate because it cannot afford for neighboring countries to start thinking that they can hit Pakistan with impunity and get away with it. After all, if Iran could do it, India would draw the same conclusions, that Pakistan, weakened by its economic problems, can hit back. But while all this drama was going on, the long march of Baloch women was also reaching its culmination point. And this is where there's something genuinely new happening in Baloch society. Remember, Dr. Mahrang Baloch and the women and students who are supporting her aren't trained insurgents. They're not inspired by Maoism or Jihadism. They're just asking for their legitimate rights. They're not even secessionists asking for an independent Balochistan. Just people asking for their own country's army to stop atrocities that have claimed the lives of thousands of people. The Pakistan government doesn't seem to know how to respond to these briefs. Courts in Pakistan have given a succession of orders asking for this return of the so-called disappeared. Habeas corpus petition after habeas corpus petition has been passed. But the disappearances continue. In many cases, the Pakistan government, operating through militia backed by its army or by its intelligence services, are known to have tortured and even killed democratic rights activists. The state believes that giving any space at all to democratic Baloch opposition would ignite the situation and give an opportunity to separateness. This is a short-sighted policy, and by installing political proxies in the region, Pakistan hasn't done itself any real favors. The rise of the Baloch Long March and figures like Mahrang Baloch show that the Pakistani state can't beat its way out of this problem with a lathi or shoot its way out by creating uh, enemy insurgents. The same situation, interestingly, is arising in the northwest frontier province or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where more and more forces like the Awami National Party have been reviving the heritage of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and waging a democratic movement for rights against the dominance of the military and local elites, even as the army is trying to settle and hand over the area to its jihadist clients. This is definitely a new and fascinating phase in Pakistani politics, where a young generation is expressing a complete breakdown of faith in the establishment and trying to forge a new democratic politics through which it can change its nation's destiny. When Mahrang Baloch's rapturous welcome at the university in Quetta prove a turning point in Pakistan's fortunes? It's hard to say. Certainly, with elections just around the corner in February, it's unlikely that Baloch oppositionists will have the time to set up a genuine political alternative to the mainstream parties. But the young people we're seeing on the streets will undoubtedly have an enormous influence on the future of Balochistan and the course of its political history. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm contributing editor at ThePrint.